History's full of all sorts of people doing really bad things in God's name. The most obvious example, of course, is the religious leaders in Jesus' time who believe that in trying and crucifying Jesus, they're doing God's will. And of course, later on, they persecute the church, also thinking they're doing God's will. But of course, this is not a Jewish problem. This is an everybody problem. And so when we look in our own history, we can also see examples of this happening too. So crusaders going to the Holy Land during the Middle Ages and thinking that they're doing God's will when they kill Muslims. Or church officials who persecuted and executed Anabaptists because they were baptized again according to their conscience. Or in our modern context, the people of Westboro Baptist who 10, 15 years ago made a name for themselves picketing the funerals of people with signs proclaiming how much God hates gay people. There's lots of ways that we can cause harm and hurt to other people and feel righteous about it. You see, when we do this, our culture or subcultural assumptions determine what is right and wrong for us, what is desirable and undesirable, the ends to which we should devote our lives. And when these are based on our human cultural understandings, we can harm people. Now, identifying the cultural understandings of people from other cultures is quite easy. But understanding them in our own culture, critiquing our own beliefs, especially the most cherished beliefs, is very difficult. It's a bit like asking a fish to describe water. If the fish has lived its entire life in water, what would it even have as a basis of comparison? And so if we want to serve God, but not actually hurt people in the process of doing so, we have to let God transform our mind, to change our thinking and our most deeply held values. And if we don't do that, we may end up destroying things in a terrible way while trying to do what's right. Just consider a story from the Judges. Now, if you're not familiar with Jewish history, the Judges is the period after God leads the children of Israel out of their slavery in Egypt and after they've conquered the land of Canaan. In the process, they've displaced most of the land's original inhabitants, but there are some that remain. And the religious practices of the remaining Canaanites seem very seductive to the Israelites. And so although they've had God reveal himself to them on Mount Sinai, the Israelites start to eye the religious life of the Canaanites jealously, and they start to abandon the worship of God and start to worship other gods. When they do this, God allows foreign oppressors to come and occupy the land and make life kind of hard for the people as a wake-up call. But eventually, the people always wise up to the fact that they're doing what they're not supposed to be doing, and they cry out to God to deliver them. When they cry out, God raises up a judge. And by judge, I don't mean a person in a robe and a powder wig, but a military leader who can lead the people of Israel against the foreign oppressors so that they can kick them out of the land. And of course, this happens time and time again, and the children of Israel live faithfully to God for a period of time. And then the judge dies and the people slide back into the pattern of idolatry. And this happens over and over and over again. But the imaginations of the Israelites are impaired during this process. They understand stuff about God at the beginning that they start to forget as they become more and more like their Canaanite neighbors. Until by the end of the story of Judges, there's barely any distinction between them at all, if any. Jephthah is a judge towards the end of this cycle. He and the people of his time are thoroughly Canaanized. And we see that in the way that Jephthah makes a rash vow. Now, Jephthah is an outsider. He's the son of an important man and a prostitute. And his brothers, by his father's wife, drive him out of their homeland, where he goes somewhere else and gathers an army of scoundrels around. The children of Israel descend into idolatry, and God allows one of their neighbors, in this case the Ammonites, to start oppressing them. And when this happens, as usual, the children of Israel cry out to God, saying, "Please deliver us." And so God raises up Jephthah to be their deliverer. Jephthah agrees to lead the children of Israel, and just before going into battle against the Ammonites, we read a story about how Jephthah makes a fateful vow to God. Reading in Judges chapter 11, verses 30 to 39, we read this. "And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, 'If you give the Ammonites into my hand, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering.' Then Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. He devastated 20 towns from Aroer in the vicinity of Minnith as far as Abel-Keramim. Thus Israel subdued Ammon. When Jephthah returned to his home in Mitzpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of timbrels? She was his only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. And when he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, 'Oh no, my daughter! You have brought me down, and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break.' 'My father,' she replied, 'you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request,' she said. 'Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry.' 'You may go,' he said. And he let her go for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. After 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed." Now, I don't know who Jephthah thought was going to come out to greet him. I'm guessing his mother-in-law was in town, and she had a habit of being the first one out the door. Now, I love my mother-in-law, but, not everybody does. But Jephthah says he's going to sacrifice somebody. Human sacrifice, especially sacrifice of one's own children, was a common religious practice by the Canaanites in that land. But it was not something that God was willing to accept among his people. In the book of the law, Deuteronomy, God singles out child sacrifice as the most grievous thing that the Canaanites do. In Deuteronomy 12:31, he says, "You must not worship the Lord your God in their way," the Canaanites' way, "because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods." So God does not want people to worship him by sacrificing their children. But the problem is that poor Jephthah has been marinating in the toxic Canaanite culture his entire life. The children of Israel have lost a vision of who God is, and their understanding of God is shaped by their culture around them. He thinks that God is just like the ancient Near Eastern warrior deities of the nations around Israel, who might think that sacrificing their daughter or son is an appropriate act of worship. The tragedy, of course, is that he should have known better. He should never have made the vow in the first place, to be sure. But even if he had made the vow and he came home and there's his daughter, he should have said, "Well, we're in a bit of a pickle here, aren't we? If I break my vow, I'm sinning before the Lord, but if I keep my vow, I'm also sinning before the Lord, because the Lord does not accept human sacrifice as an act of worship." And so he should have said, "I regret I made that vow. I shouldn't have. Lord, forgive me, for I will break it." But he doesn't understand that that's who God is. We can't understand what pleases God unless we allow him to first challenge our deeply held cultural values. Paul lays this out very clearly in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, when he says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." If we think in the ways that the world thinks, God's will doesn't make sense to us. Recently, we looked at the story about Jesus telling the disciples for the first time that he was going to be crucified. And Peter takes him aside and says, "Oh, that'll never happen." What does Jesus say to Peter? He rebukes him. He says, "Get behind me, Satan." Why? Because you have the things of man in mind and not the things of God. If Peter had a mind that was transformed according to the power of the Holy Spirit, then Peter would have understood that while Jesus was doing something that looked like he was losing, this was actually the Father's will. This is how the Father was going to overcome the power of sin and death in the world. And he would have been supportive rather than oppositional to what God was doing. And in the same way, until we have transformed minds, God's will just seems like nonsense. It seems like, oh, that's a great idea, but it'll never work. And so we have to allow him to transform our thinking. You see, Jephthah, the Jewish authorities, the Crusaders, the church officials who persecuted the Anabaptists, the people of Westboro Baptist, they all made the same mistake. And if they can all make it, then we have the same capacity to make that mistake. Letting God challenge our deeply held cultural beliefs is disturbing. It's uncomfortable. It's lonely because we may find ourselves at odds with everybody else around us who has no problem with a certain pattern of behavior or a certain value. If we don't find this as an uncomfortable process, then we can be assured that we are actually not doing the process. We as Christians know we need to change, but we often try to keep the change on the surface level. We just want to modify our external behaviors. And so Christianity descends into moralism. I don't drink, smoke, or chew, or go around with girls that do. Well, that's not what God is after. Because when we simply make our behavior good, our standard of good behavior is still defined by our culture. And the Jewish authorities who killed Jesus thought that they were behaving well, because within their cultural context and their cultural understanding, they were. Jephthah thought he was honoring God by offering his daughter as a sacrifice. He didn't realize that God wasn't thinking like the people around him. And so Christian faith is not about modification of behavior. It's about transformation into a different person. And that starts from the inside out. When we allow God to challenge the very deepest things that we believe are true about ourselves, about him, and about the world. And so, if we don't do this work, if we try to short-circuit that process and say, I'm just going to try to serve God as seems best to me with my worldly wisdom, what we're going to do is we're going to try to serve God while wreaking havoc on ourselves and the people around us. So I want to look at a couple examples of ideas that are in our church, in the zeitgeist, that are opposed to the values of God's kingdom. Just to show us that it's easy for us to buy into ideas that are not Christian. The first of these is self-reliance. We say, God helps those who help themselves. Well, that's not in the Bible. And in fact, that sentiment is not consistent with what God teaches his people. Self-reliance is a cultural value that stands in opposition to Christian value. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't work hard. I'm not saying we shouldn't have industry and we shouldn't have, a desire to go out and make things so that we can provide for our families and provide for people around us generously. But it's not a virtue to not need other people. Independence is a cultural value. We like independence because if I'm the sort of person that really holds to this ethos of I need to stand on my own 2 feet, then I feel proud by what I accomplish. it also allows me to, feel like I'm better than other people. And it allows me to turn my back on the suffering of other people. I don't want to help that person. If I help that person, I would deprive them of the opportunity to stand on their own 2 feet. That would be an unkind and unloving thing to do. Therefore, I'll just let them work that out for themselves. Independence is not a kingdom value. Interdependence is a kingdom value. Interdependence means that I rely on you and I let you rely on me. There are things that I do well, and I give those things freely, generously to other people in the community. And there are things I don't do well. There are areas where I just can't hack it on my own, and that's okay. God has given me those deficiencies as a gift because it's those places that other people can give generously to me. And as I walk through that giving and receiving, I grow in love and generosity as I give. And I grow in humility as I receive. I remember I was on a missions trip in Costa Rica. And they put me up in a bedroom and I went to bed. I didn't even know how the house was laid out. I hadn't really paid much attention. I went to bed, and in the middle of the night I had to go to the bathroom or outhouse. I can't remember what they had. And I stepped out of the room and into the hallway, and there was the father and several of his children sleeping on the floor in the hall because they had given me the bedroom. I felt terrible. I would never ask somebody to do that for me. And I wouldn't. But I realized that I had to learn to humble myself. That these were people with agency who were choosing to do this as an act of submission and love to me. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to stand on my own 2 feet. But they wanted to love me. And I had to humble myself to receive that. So we have to ask ourselves, not just are we willing to be generous with other people? Of course that's important. But are we willing to let them be generous with us when it means that we have to humble ourselves and admit that we have need for them? That shows us a conflict between our cultural values and our kingdom values. Another example I see more clearly in the United States culture, but it is present in our own culture and growing there, and that's Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is the idea that the church ought to be in charge of the country. And of course, if the church ought to be in charge of the country, then doing what we must do in order to gain power for ourselves is commendable. This often involves behaviors that are at odds with the teachings of Jesus. Rather than generosity and kindness, it often involves deceit or aggressiveness. Because, of course, God needs our help to build his kingdom, and we've got to do what we've got to do. But I think that this doctrine, this idea, comes out of a stunted imagination that can't contemplate that God can actually bring about his own kingdom. And that's not what our job is. If we look at the life of Jesus, what do we see? We don't see Jesus saying, I'm going to bring God's kingdom. I'm going to do what has to be done in order to do that. I'm going to humiliate and destroy my enemies. It's regrettable but necessary. No, Jesus simply says, well, this is what the Father's will is. I'm going to do that faithfully and trust that the Father in heaven can take my obedience and turn that into victory. Nothing about Jesus' strategy looks like a good idea. This is not an advisable strategy for initiating a kingdom. Let people kill you. But because it is the Father's will, when Jesus does it, God is able to turn that into a victory. And lo and behold, Jesus conquers sin and death by allowing himself to be killed. And so Jesus challenges our notion that we need to be in charge. We need to get power. We see this also in the life of Paul. Paul did so much amazing stuff. He wrote so much of our New Testament. And Paul's got some undisclosed physical ailment. He calls it a thorn in the flesh, but he doesn't tell us what it is. And what it is doesn't really matter. What really matters is the fact that Paul realizes he's being held back. There's something that if God took that thing away, imagine how much more I could do for you, God. And so he goes to God and he says, God, take this thing away from me. And God doesn't want to. We read about it in 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. It's Paul's lack of strength that demonstrates the power of God most clearly in his life. So Paul takes his weakness and he embraces it. He makes it a part of his identity. God brings God's kingdom, and we merely enter it in weakness. That's how God works. We don't have to amass power for ourselves. Jesus and the early church never had power. And look at all they accomplished. It's also worth pointing out that Christian leaders who want to be influential bigwigs, who want to gain power, often do so in ways that are contrary to the teachings of Jesus with regard to conflict. The best way to motivate your base is to get them angry. And so you say things like, if you don't stand up against, insert your boogeyman here, we're not going to have a country left. And your children will get wrecked. They always bring your children into it because they know that that just needles people in a very painful place. We don't want anything bad to happen to our kids. Of course, we don't want anything bad to happen to our kids. But they fan the flames of resentment, believing that this is what's going to bring about God's kingdom, contrary to the teaching of God. What does Jesus say about conflict? Does he say, own your enemies? Torture them, humiliate them, and then they'll understand that I'm God? No. Jesus says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Do good to those who mistreat you. He tells us that if you don't forgive your brother or your sister when they sin against you, you will not be forgiven. Everything Jesus does and tells us about conflict is designed to tamp it down, to diffuse the conflict, to nip it in the bud, not to amplify it so that we can use people's outrage as a tool, as a political weapon. And so Christian nationalism is a profound failure of the Christian imagination. It's a distrust in God's ability to do what God is going to do. And so it says, hey, we are going to have to do it. God obviously doesn't know what he's talking about. Which, obviously I don't agree with. But that's the basic underlying assumption. So, God wants us to be transformed. But we want to skip over that painful process of exposing our heart's deepest desires and values to divine judgment. By judgment, I don't mean condemnation. I mean that God looks at our heart and tells us what is what. That thing you want, you think that's life-giving. It's not. That leads to death. That thing that you think is good is actually an idol in your life. You need to give that up. That thing you're looking to will never give you satisfaction. You got to stop looking there and look to me. It's only when we all submit to God's wisdom in doing this that our hearts and minds can be transformed. Well, God's will is like new wine. And our old cultural assumptions are like old wineskins. What does Jesus tell us happens when we put new wine into old wineskins? Jesus says, if you do that, they will burst. And the wines and the wineskin will be ruined. Well, Jephthah's story shows us in very stark terms what that looks like in a real person's life. He is devastated because what he holds dear is destroyed. And it didn't have to happen if only he'd let his mind be renewed by the power of the Spirit. So if we want to serve God, we have to do the hard work of letting him examine, challenge and reshape our deepest values. But if we don't, it causes so much pain. So let's let the Spirit transform our minds. Let's let God dismantle our idols.